Imagine a small church standing alone on the Oregon Trail, a place where exhausted families stopped for food, prayer, and rest. But what if that church was never meant to save anyone? For over 36 years, the Sacred Heart Chapel hid one of the darkest secrets in American frontier history. A family that turned faith into a weapon, kindness into control, and trust into a deadly trap. More than 800 travelers entered seeking safety and were never seen again. If you enjoy dark, real-life history and forgotten truths, subscribe to the channel now. And tell me in the comments, which state are you watching from? In the early 1850s, the Oregon Trail was a road of hope and fear. Families traveled for months in wooden wagons, crossing rivers, deserts, and endless plains. Many were hungry, sick, and exhausted by the time they reached the deep wilderness of the Oregon Territory. Every mile forward felt like a test from God. People prayed for signs of safety, clean water, friendly faces, or even a roof for one night. That was why the sight of the Sacred Heart Chapel felt like a miracle to so many travelers. The chapel stood near a narrow bend in the trail, surrounded by tall trees and quiet land. It was not large, but it looked peaceful. A wooden cross rose above the roof, and a small bell hung near the door. At night, lantern light glowed softly from the windows, guiding travelers like a lighthouse in the dark wilderness. After weeks of sleeping on cold ground, the sight of a church made people feel protected. To many, it felt like God had placed the chapel exactly where it was needed. The Grayson family welcomed travelers with calm smiles and gentle voices. They dressed simply and spoke often about faith, charity, and duty. The father of the family introduced himself as the caretaker of the chapel. His wife prepared food, while their children helped lead wagons to safe resting spots. They asked for nothing in return: no money, no goods, no labor. All they wanted, they said, was to offer Christian kindness to those in need. For desperate families, this kindness felt rare and holy. Travelers were invited to rest, eat warm meals, and join evening prayer. Many cried openly during the service, overwhelmed by relief. Mothers thanked God, fathers lowered their guards, children slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The Graysons spoke softly about protection, salvation, and the dangers of the trail ahead. They warned travelers not to rush, not to travel at night, and not to trust strangers. Ironically, these warnings only increased the trust people placed in them. What no one noticed at first was how controlled everything felt. The Graysons decided where wagons were parked. They asked families to separate for prayer, saying it helped cleanse the soul. Men were guided to barns or sheds, while women and children were shown small rooms inside the chapel or nearby buildings. These requests were framed as religious tradition, not commands. Most travelers agreed without hesitation, believing they were following God's order. The chapel itself felt old, even though it had not been there for generations. The wood was dark and worn, as if it had absorbed years of silence. Some doors were always locked. Some areas were never mentioned. When asked about the land, the Graysons said it had been blessed and protected from evil. They claimed God had chosen their family to guard this place and help lost souls find rest before continuing west. As days turned into years, the Sacred Heart Chapel became a known stop along the trail. Word spread quietly among wagon trains. "There is a church ahead," people would say. "Good people live there." Many planned their journey around reaching it. For some, it became the only safe place they trusted in a dangerous world. That reputation gave the Grayson family power built entirely on belief. Yet strange patterns began forming, though few noticed at the time. Travelers who stayed at the chapel were rarely seen again on the trail. Other wagon trains assumed they had taken a different route or settled nearby. On the frontier, disappearance was common. Disease, weather, and accidents claimed lives every day. No one thought to blame a church. Faith made the idea unthinkable. The Graysons kept records, but not the kind anyone expected. They noted names, arrival dates, and family sizes. They watched carefully, choosing who would be welcomed warmly and who would be judged quietly. They believed the wilderness was a test sent by God, and not everyone deserved to survive it. Over time, their belief turned darker. Helping travelers became something else entirely, something hidden behind prayer and scripture. To outsiders, the chapel remained peaceful. Songs drifted through the trees, smoke rose gently from cooking fires. The bell rang at sunrise and sunset. Everything looked holy. But beneath the calm surface, something cold was forming. The Graysons were no longer just caretakers of faith. They were deciding who was worthy of moving forward and who was not. For the travelers, the chapel represented safety in a lawless land. They did not know that the same place offering rest was also watching them closely. Trust was the key that opened every door. Exhaustion made people careless. Faith made them obedient. The Grayson family understood this deeply, and they used it without mercy. This was how it began, not with violence, but with kindness, not with screams, but with prayers. The Sacred Heart Chapel did not trap people with chains, it trapped them with belief. And on the Oregon Trail, belief was often stronger than fear. Part 1 of this story is not about death yet, it is about trust. It is about how easily hope can be shaped into something dangerous. The chapel stood quietly as wagons arrived one by one, never knowing that some paths do not lead forward. Some places are not shelters at all, but gates that close forever once you step inside. When travelers woke up their first morning at the Sacred Heart Chapel, most felt grateful and safe. The food had been warm, the beds were dry, and no danger had touched them during the night. For people who had lived for months on the trail, this felt like a blessing. The Grayson family greeted everyone with calm smiles and soft prayers, reminding them to thank God for protection. Nothing seemed strange at first, but slowly visitors began to realize that kindness at the chapel always came with rules. The Graysons believed charity should be guided, not free. They explained this gently, using religious language that sounded wise and caring. They said too much freedom led people towards sin, especially on the dangerous frontier. Every traveler, they claimed, needed structure, obedience, and spiritual cleansing before continuing west. Most families agreed. After all, these words came from people who looked holy and spoke with confidence. Questioning them felt like questioning faith itself. Meals were offered at set times, and everyone was expected to attend prayer before eating. Missing prayer was quietly frowned upon. The Graysons said it was for unity and protection. During prayer, they watched carefully. They noticed who bowed their heads, who whispered doubts, and who looked uncomfortable. These small reactions mattered more than travelers realized. The family believed God spoke through behavior, and they judged people accordingly. One of the first conditions appeared when travelers were told they must stay at least one full night, sometimes two. The Graysons warned that leaving too soon invited misfortune. They told stories of families who ignored advice and were later found dead on the trail. Fear made people listen. Even those who felt uneasy stayed longer than planned, convincing themselves it was safer to trust the chapel than the wilderness. Another condition was separation. The Graysons said families needed individual confession to cleanse hidden sins. Men were led away to barns or sheds under the excuse of private prayer. Women and children were taken inside the chapel or nearby rooms. This separation was described as holy tradition. The family insisted it strengthened faith and removed temptation. Many parents hesitated, but exhaustion and belief overcame doubt. They did not want to appear ungrateful or sinful. Once separated, travelers lost control. Conversations were guided. Questions were answered slowly or not at all. The Graysons spoke kindly but firmly, reminding people that obedience was a sign of true faith. Anyone who resisted was gently warned that pride could lead to punishment from God. These warnings were never shouted, they were whispered, which made them more powerful. The Grayson children also played a role. They acted polite and helpful, guiding guests, carrying water, and repeating prayers. To visitors, this made the family seem pure and well-raised. What no one realized was that these children were being trained. They were taught to observe, remember, and report behavior. Charity was not just kindness to the Graysons, it was a system passed from one generation to the next. Over time, travelers noticed they were being watched. The way they spoke, the way they prayed, even the way they ate was quietly judged. Some felt uncomfortable but could not explain why. Others blamed their nerves or tired minds. On the frontier, stress was normal. Few imagined the chapel itself could be dangerous. The Graysons often spoke about worthy souls. They said not everyone traveling west had pure intentions. Some were greedy, sinful, or weak in faith. God, they claimed, used people like the Graysons to protect the land from such corruption. This idea slowly prepared the ground for something darker. Travelers nodded along, never thinking they might be judged unworthy themselves. At night, doors were locked for safety. The family said wild animals and criminals roamed the area. Lanterns were turned low, and silence was enforced after prayer. Anyone who tried to leave their room was questioned the next morning. These rules were presented as care, not control. And because the wilderness was truly dangerous, the rules felt reasonable. The most disturbing condition was confession. One by one, travelers were called aside to speak privately with a Grayson elder. These confessions were not gentle conversations. They were long, uncomfortable sessions filled with probing questions. The Graysons asked about past sins, doubts about God, anger, fear, and secrets. People revealed more than they intended, believing honesty would protect them. They did not realize this information was being used to judge their fate. Some travelers sensed something was wrong and tried to leave early. The Graysons never stopped them by force. Instead, they used words. They warned of storms ahead, broken bridges, hostile lands, and divine punishment. Fear and guilt pulled people back inside. Those who insisted on leaving were watched carefully, marked as dangerous or ungrateful. Charity at Sacred Heart Chapel was never free. Every meal, every prayer, every kind word came with expectations. The Graysons believed they were not just helping travelers, they were correcting them. In their minds, obedience proved worthiness. Disobedience revealed corruption. Over the years, this belief hardened into certainty. What made the system so effective was patience. The Graysons did not rush. They let trust grow slowly. They allowed travelers to relax, to feel safe, and to depend on them. Only then did the conditions tighten. By the time visitors realized they had lost control, it felt too late to resist. To the outside world, the chapel remained a symbol of hope. No screams escaped, no violence was seen. Everything happened quietly, wrapped in prayer and calm voices. This silence protected the Graysons better than walls ever could. Part 2 of this story shows how evil does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives with kindness, rules, and gentle words. At Sacred Heart Chapel, charity became a tool, faith became a leash, and the travelers, desperate for safety, walked willingly into a system designed to judge them long before they ever understood the price of trust.
By the time travelers reached their second or third day at the Sacred Heart Chapel, something had already changed inside them. The fear of the trail slowly faded, replaced by a quiet pressure to behave, obey, and please the Grayson family. What felt like kindness at first now felt like expectation. Faith was no longer just comfort, it had become a rule book, and the Graysons were the ones holding it. The Graysons spoke often about God's judgment. They said the wilderness was not random, it was designed to test souls. According to them, storms, hunger, and death were signs of divine selection. Only the faithful, the obedient, and the pure deserved to reach the Western lands. These ideas were shared calmly, like lessons, not threats. That calmness made them powerful. People listened carefully, afraid of misunderstanding God's will. Prayer at the chapel grew longer and more intense. Travelers were asked to kneel until their legs hurt, to repeat verses again and again, and to confess not just sins, but thoughts. Doubt was treated as danger. Fear was treated as weakness. The Graysons taught that questioning authority was the same as questioning God. Slowly, travelers learned to silence themselves. Confession sessions became more aggressive. What began as spiritual guidance turned into interrogation. The Graysons asked about private arguments, hidden anger, jealousy, greed, and secret regrets. They asked fathers if they had ever doubted their role as leaders. They asked mothers if they had ever resented their children. They asked young people about forbidden thoughts. Each answer was judged, not forgiven. The family believed truth revealed worthiness. Scripture was used carefully, but never fully. The Graysons quoted verses about obedience, punishment, and sacrifice while ignoring those about mercy. They twisted holy words to support their beliefs. To tired travelers, the Bible sounded different in the wilderness. Without churches, pastors, or community, the Graysons' voice became the only authority. Faith had been isolated, and isolation made it easy to control. The chapel's rules tightened. Travelers were told when to wake, when to eat, when to speak, and when to sleep. Silence was praised as devotion. Curiosity was called temptation. Those who followed rules were praised publicly during prayer. Those who hesitated were corrected privately. This created fear without noise. No one wanted to be singled out. The Grayson family believed fear was useful. They did not see it as cruelty. In their minds, fear brought people closer to God. They believed suffering purified the soul. If someone cried, shook, or begged, it was seen as proof that sin was leaving the body. Compassion was replaced by judgment. Sympathy was replaced by duty. Children were especially vulnerable. The Graysons told them stories about angels watching every action and demons waiting for mistakes. Obedient children were promised protection. Disobedient ones were warned of punishment beyond death. Parents watched in silence, unsure whether to comfort their children or trust the family's teachings. Fear broke natural bonds, replacing them with dependence on the chapel. Men were told their role was submission to divine order. Strength was no longer physical, it was obedience. Those who questioned the Graysons' authority were labeled prideful. Pride, they said, was the greatest sin. Once labeled, a man was watched closely. His words were remembered. His actions were measured. Judgment had begun long before any decision was made. Women were taught silence and sacrifice. The Graysons claimed suffering was holy, especially for mothers. They encouraged women to accept hardship without complaint. Tears were called weakness. Endurance was praised as faith. Slowly, women stopped speaking openly. They believed their pain had meaning, even when it felt wrong. The most dangerous change was internal. Travelers began policing themselves. They corrected each other. They reminded one another to pray, to stay quiet, to obey. The Graysons did not need to enforce every rule anymore. Faith had been turned inward, shaping behavior from the inside. This was control at its deepest level. At night, the chapel felt different. The air was heavy. Lantern light flickered against wooden walls that seemed to listen. Sounds traveled strangely. Footsteps, whispers, muffled cries that were quickly explained away as wind or animals. Anyone who asked questions was told the wilderness played tricks on the mind. Tired people believed it. The Graysons kept smiling. That was what confused many travelers the most. There was no rage, no shouting, no visible cruelty. Everything was done with calm voices and steady eyes. Violence, when it came, was not sudden. It was prepared carefully, justified long before it happened. Faith was the weapon that made resistance feel sinful. Some travelers tried to pray for guidance, but their prayers had already been shaped by the chapel. They asked God for forgiveness instead of protection. They blamed themselves for fear instead of questioning the situation. This was exactly what the Graysons wanted. A person who believes they deserve punishment rarely tries to escape it. By this stage, the chapel no longer felt like a stop on the journey. It felt like a final test. The Graysons spoke about Judgment Day, about separating the worthy from the unworthy. They claimed God required action, not mercy. To them, sparing the unworthy was disobedience. Killing, in their minds, became service. Part 3 of this story is where the line disappears. Faith stops being belief and becomes a tool. Prayer stops being comfort and becomes control. The Graysons did not see themselves as murderers. They saw themselves as instruments of God. And that belief, quiet, absolute, and unchallenged, was the most dangerous thing of all. This was how faith was weaponized. Not through force, but through fear dressed as holiness. Not through chains, but through belief that made people bow willingly. By the time travelers sensed the truth, their faith had already been turned against them, and the chapel no longer offered salvation, only judgment.
As the years passed, the Oregon Trail continued to carry thousands of families westward, but something strange began to happen along one stretch of the route. Wagon trains that were carefully counted at earlier checkpoints arrived at later settlements, missing people. Sometimes it was a single family, sometimes it was several wagons at once. Names disappeared quietly from travel lists. At first, no one questioned it. The frontier was dangerous and death was common. Most people assumed sickness, accidents, or bad weather were to blame. The Sacred Heart Chapel sat directly in the middle of this mystery, yet no suspicion touched it. A church was the last place anyone thought to question. Travelers who passed by spoke well of it. They remembered warm meals, prayers, and kind faces. Those who never left the chapel were not there to tell a different story. Silence protected the Grayson family better than any weapon. Local traders and trail guides noticed patterns long before authorities did. They saw wagons abandoned near the chapel grounds, later claimed by the Graysons as left behind by the dead. Livestock changed hands. Gold coins appeared quietly in local markets. The Graysons explained it all calmly. They said they buried the dead, cared for orphaned belongings, and used the goods to support the chapel. Their explanations sounded reasonable, even noble. Families who vanished left no screams behind, no signs of struggle on the trail. That was what made the disappearances easy to ignore. The Graysons were careful. Nothing looked violent from the outside. Wagons were dismantled neatly, personal items were cleaned, trails were erased by time and rain. The frontier swallowed evidence quickly, and the chapel stood untouched in the middle of it all. As disappearances continued, fear spread among travelers, but not toward the chapel. Instead, fear was aimed outward. People spoke of cursed lands, hostile wilderness, and God's punishment. The Graysons encouraged these beliefs. During prayer, they spoke of divine wrath and testing. They reminded travelers that survival depended on obedience and faith. Every missing family became proof that God removed the unworthy. Trail authorities were few and far apart. Records were poorly kept. If a family failed to arrive, there was rarely an investigation. Distance made justice slow, and belief made questions uncomfortable. Who would accuse a church of wrongdoing without proof? Who would dare question people who spoke in God's name? The Graysons took advantage of this isolation. They began keeping detailed records, not for the law, but for themselves. Names, ages, family size, supplies, and behavior were carefully written down. These records were not emotional. They were neat, cold, and organized. The family believed order was holy. Killing without record would have felt wrong to them. The disappearances also served another purpose. They strengthened the Graysons' control over remaining travelers.
When people heard that families had gone missing after ignoring advice, fear grew stronger. Obedience increased. No one wanted to be the next lesson. The chapel became both a refuge and a warning. Some travelers noticed empty spaces around the chapel, areas where grass grew differently, where the ground felt softer underfoot. When asked, the Graysons said they were burial sites for those who died from illness. Death on the frontier was common, and most people did not want to look too closely. Grief and exhaustion made curiosity feel dangerous. Nearby settlements slowly sensed something was wrong, but no one could explain it. Too many goods flowed from one place. Too many families vanished near the same stretch of land. Still, without survivors or witnesses, suspicion faded into rumor. Rumors did not travel far in a land focused on survival. The Graysons grew more confident. Each disappearance reinforced their belief that they were untouchable. God, they thought, was protecting them. Years passed without consequence. Children in the Grayson family grew up watching this system work. They learned that silence was safety and faith was power. Killing became routine, wrapped in prayer and record-keeping. The chapel itself expanded quietly. New rooms were added, cellars were deepened, wooden floors were replaced when they grew too worn. Every change was explained as maintenance. Travelers rarely explored beyond allowed areas. They trusted the Graysons to guide them, and the family guided them exactly where they wanted. Some travelers sensed danger too late. They noticed how quiet the nights were, how few guests seemed to leave, but fear and confusion kept them still. By then, the chapel had already marked them. Once marked, there was no return to the trail. What made the disappearances so effective was time. They did not happen all at once. They were spread over decades. No single year looked suspicious. No single event shocked the nation. Evil survived because it moved slowly and hid inside normal life. The Graysons did not see themselves as criminals. They believed they were caretakers of balance. In their minds, the frontier was sacred, and not everyone deserved to cross it. The missing families were not victims, they were offerings. This belief allowed the Graysons to sleep at night and smile during prayer. Part 4 of this story is about absence. It is about empty wagons, unfinished journeys, and names that never reached their destination. It shows how evil can exist in plain sight when people explain it away. The disappearances were not sudden or loud. They were quiet, steady, and ignored. By the time anyone began to connect the dots, hundreds of lives had already vanished into the soil around Sacred Heart Chapel, and the Grayson family, protected by faith and distance, continued their work, unchallenged, unquestioned, and convinced that God was on their side.
Hidden beneath the wooden floor of the Sacred Heart Chapel was the most dangerous object the Grayson family ever created. It was not a weapon, not a locked room, not even a grave. It was a book, a simple hand-stitched ledger kept away from all visitors. This book turned murder into routine and faith into paperwork. To the Graysons, it was not a record of evil, it was proof of duty. The ledger began as a simple list. In the early years, it only contained names and dates. A family arrived, a note was made. Over time, the entries grew longer and more detailed. Each page reflected how confident and organized the Graysons had become. They believed God valued order, and disorder was a sin. Every life they took had to be documented properly. Each entry followed a pattern. The name of the head of the family came first, followed by the number of adults and children. Then came a short description of behavior. Words like obedient, questioning, prideful, or corrupted appeared often. After that, possessions were listed carefully: wagons, animals, tools, gold, books, and clothing. At the end of each entry was a small hand-drawn cross. That cross did not mean mercy, it meant judgment was complete. The Graysons believed this ledger separated them from common criminals. Criminals, in their minds, acted on desire or anger. The Graysons acted on instruction. They believed God was watching their work, and sloppy records would dishonor him. Writing names made their actions feel official, even sacred. Once a name was written, there was no turning back. The killings themselves were never rushed. The Graysons believed haste led to mistakes. Travelers were kept calm until the end. Fear, they believed, weakened the soul and made judgment messy. Everything was done quietly, away from the eyes of others. When it was over, the ledger was updated, order was restored, prayer followed. What made the ledger even more disturbing was how long it lasted. Over 36 years, page after page was filled, hundreds of entries, entire families reduced to lines of ink. Children were counted the same way as tools or animals. Emotion never appeared in the writing. There were no regrets, no doubts, no hesitation, only facts. As generations passed, the ledger became a teaching tool. Older Graysons showed it to younger ones in secret. They explained its importance, its meaning, and its responsibility. Children learned early that the family's work was holy. They were taught to respect the book, never question it. To them, the ledger was proof that their family mattered. The Graysons also believed the ledger protected them. As long as everything was written down correctly, they believed God would continue to hide their actions from the world. Each year without discovery strengthened this belief. The book became a symbol of invincibility. No law had touched them, no punishment had come. The ledger seemed to promise safety. Outside the chapel, the results of the ledger were visible in quiet ways. The Graysons never appeared poor. They always had supplies. Repairs were made quickly. New buildings appeared without explanation. Livestock numbers grew. Gold was exchanged carefully through distant traders. Nothing was wasted. The ledger ensured everything was accounted for. Despite this control, cracks began forming. As the number of entries grew, so did the risk. More pages meant more secrets. More names meant more chances for discovery. Some Graysons began to feel uneasy, not from guilt but from fear of exposure. The ledger was proof of their power, but it was also proof of their crimes. Still, the family continued. Stopping felt impossible. They believed if they ended the work, God's protection would vanish. In their minds, the ledger demanded continuation. Each generation felt trapped by the one before it. What began as belief had become obligation. The most chilling part of the ledger was its final section. Here, the Graysons began counting totals, monthly numbers, yearly numbers. This is where the true scale appeared. Hundreds became undeniable. Over 800 lives were recorded. The Graysons did not react with horror, they reacted with pride. To them, this number proved their dedication. The ledger also contained notes about mistakes, rare moments when something went wrong, a traveler who resisted more than expected, a noise that traveled too far, a close call with outsiders. These entries were written as lessons, not warnings. The family adjusted their methods, improved their system, and continued. If the ledger had ever been found earlier, the story would have ended sooner, but it remained hidden, protected by faith and fear. No traveler ever saw it, no authority suspected it existed. A church did not seem like a place where such a book could live. The ledger turned murder into administration. It removed emotion and replaced it with routine. Once something becomes routine, it becomes easier to repeat. The Graysons were no longer reacting to individuals, they were managing numbers. Part 5 of this story reveals the true heart of the Grayson operation. Not rage, not chaos, but planning. The ledger shows that this was not a series of accidents or isolated acts. It was a system, carefully maintained and passed down. In the end, the ledger would become the very thing that destroyed them. What they believed protected them would one day expose everything. But for decades, that book lay hidden beneath holy ground, quietly holding the names of the dead. Names written by people who truly believed they were doing God's work.
By the early 1880s, the Sacred Heart Chapel had existed longer than most people on the trail could remember. To travelers, it felt permanent, like a natural part of the land. To the Grayson family, it felt eternal. The work had passed from grandparents to parents to children without pause. Faith, judgment, and silence were inherited like property. No one inside the family was ever taught to question, until one did. The youngest Grayson heir grew up surrounded by prayer and rules. From childhood, this heir was taught that the family had been chosen by God. The ledger was introduced early, not as a secret of shame, but as a symbol of duty. Names were shown without faces, numbers were praised without emotion. The heir was told that doubt was temptation and mercy was weakness. For many years, the heir believed everything. But this heir was different in one quiet way. Instead of memorizing scripture alone, the heir read it fully. Not just the verses spoken during prayer, but the parts never mentioned. Words about forgiveness, mercy, and love stood out. These words did not match what happened behind closed doors. At first, the heir thought the misunderstanding was personal. Surely the elders knew better. Surely God's plan was larger than one person's feelings. The doubts did not disappear. They grew. Late at night, the heir heard sounds that no prayer explained. Soft cries, heavy footsteps, doors opening where no doors should be. When questions were asked, answers came quickly and calmly, but never fully. The heir was told that curiosity led to corruption. Still, curiosity remained. One night, when the chapel was quiet, the heir found the ledger alone. This time, it was not shown as a lesson. It was read privately, carefully, slowly. Page after page revealed families, children, dates, and totals. The scale of it became clear in a way it never had before. This was not protection. This was not judgment. This was killing, repeated hundreds of times, written in clean handwriting. For the first time, the heir saw the travelers as real people, not sinners, not numbers, families with names, children who had trusted the chapel. The weight of it pressed heavily. Faith did not disappear, but something else did, the belief that this was holy. The heir began watching the family differently. Smiles felt rehearsed, prayers felt empty. Words that once sounded wise now sounded practiced. The system that had once felt strong now felt fragile, held together by fear of change. The heir realized something terrifying. No one in the family continued because they truly believed anymore. They continued because stopping felt impossible. The moment of confrontation came quietly. During a private meeting, the elders told the heir it was time to fully participate. The work would soon be theirs to lead. Instructions were given calmly, as if discussing harvest or repairs. The heir was expected to agree without hesitation. Instead, the heir refused. There was no shouting at first. Silence filled the room. Refusal had never happened before. The elders spoke slowly, warning that doubt was spreading corruption. They reminded the heir of blood, duty, and God's protection. They said stopping would invite punishment, not just on the family, but on the land itself. The heir answered simply, killing was wrong. No scripture justified it. No ledger could change that. Fear replaced calm. The elders did not argue theology, they argued survival. They said the family had gone too far to turn back. If the truth came out, everyone would be destroyed. The heir was accused of betrayal, not just of family, but of God. From that moment, the heir was no longer trusted. Movements were watched, words were repeated back later, doors were locked more often. The heir was kept close, never alone for long. The family feared not exposure yet, but escape. They knew one voice speaking outside the chapel could undo decades of silence. The heir understood this danger and began planning carefully. Escape was not easy. The chapel was isolated. The trail was watched. Leaving without suspicion required patience. The heir pretended obedience, attended prayers, and spoke carefully. Inside, fear and resolve grew together. The breaking point came when the heir was ordered to assist directly. Not with records, not with prayer, with action. That night, something inside the heir hardened. There would be no more pretending. During a storm, when wind and rain covered sound, the air ran. The escape was desperate and unplanned. Darkness swallowed the land. Branches tore at clothes. The air did not know the trail well anymore. The chapel had been the world for so long. Behind, voices shouted. Lanterns moved in the distance. The family did not want mercy. They wanted silence restored. The air was wounded but did not stop. Faith, once used as a chain, became strength. This time, prayer was not about obedience, it was about survival. Hours later, the air collapsed near a distant settlement, barely conscious. The words spoken before losing awareness were broken and confused, but enough. A chapel, a ledger, families disappearing. At first, no one believed it, but the fear in the air's voice was real. For the Grayson family, the escape was disaster. The system depended on secrecy. One crack threatened everything. Some elders argued the air would not be believed. Others feared God had finally turned away. Panic replaced certainty for the first time in decades. Part 6 of this story is about rupture. One person choosing truth over tradition. One refusal against generations of obedience. The air did not destroy the system that night, but weakened it. And once silence breaks, it never fully returns. The Grayson legacy had survived storms, distance, and time. What it could not survive was doubt from within. And that doubt, once spoken, would soon grow louder than prayer.
The truth about the Sacred Heart Chapel did not explode into the world all at once. It began quietly, with confusion, disbelief, and fear. When the wounded Grayson heir was found near the settlement, people first thought it was another frontier tragedy. Injuries were common. Fear was common. But as the heir slowly recovered, the story did not change. The same words were repeated again and again. A chapel, a family, disappearances, and a book filled with names. At first, local leaders did not want to listen. Accusing a church felt dangerous. Faith held communities together on the frontier. If the story was false, repeating it could destroy trust. But the details were too specific to ignore. Dates, descriptions, locations, and patterns all matched long-standing rumors. Missing families, abandoned wagons, goods that never made sense. The pieces began to connect. Federal marshals were contacted quietly. No public announcement was made. Officials feared panic among travelers still moving west. They also feared resistance. A religious family accused of mass murder was not something the frontier was prepared to face. So the investigation moved carefully, slowly, and in silence. When the marshals arrived near the Sacred Heart Chapel, they did not see a monster. They saw a peaceful place. Smoke rose from the chimney. The chapel bell rang as it always had. The Grayson family greeted them calmly, offering food and prayer. There was no panic in their voices, no attempt to flee. To the marshals, this calm was unsettling. The Graysons denied nothing directly, but explained everything away. They spoke of charity, burial duties, and frontier dangers. They said travelers died often, and someone had to care for what was left behind. Their words sounded practiced. Their smiles did not change. But the marshals were no longer listening to words alone. They were watching movements, reactions, and silence. The search began respectfully at first. The chapel was inspected. Outbuildings were checked. Everything looked ordinary, too ordinary. Then attention turned to places visitors were never allowed. Locked doors, sealed rooms, floors that looked newer than the rest of the building. When asked for access, the Graysons hesitated for the first time. That hesitation ended everything. When the floorboards were lifted, the truth could no longer hide. Beneath the chapel were tunnels and storage spaces built over many years. Some were empty, some were not. Bones were found, human remains buried carefully, quietly, without markers.
The deeper the search went, the worse it became. Mass graves surrounded the property. The soil told the story words never could. The Grayson family did not scream. They did not beg. Some prayed. Some stood in silence. Others collapsed under the weight of discovery. Decades of control had ended in a single day. Faith, once used as armor, offered no protection now. Then the ledger was found. Hidden beneath holy ground, wrapped carefully, untouched by time. Page after page confirmed what the heir had said. Names, families, totals, crosses marking judgment. Over 800 lives recorded without remorse. The marshals understood immediately that this was not madness, it was planning. The chapel had not been a place of worship, it had been an operation. Arrests followed quickly. Some Graysons resisted, others did not. A few attempted to destroy evidence but were stopped. During transport, chaos erupted. One elder died under unclear circumstances. Another vanished during a transfer between towns, never to be found. Whether escape or execution occurred was never confirmed. Silence followed again, but this time it felt different. News spread slowly, carefully controlled by authorities. They feared public outrage, loss of trust in religion, and panic along the trail. Reports were softened. Words like fraud and misconduct were used publicly, while the full horror remained hidden in sealed documents. Only fragments reached newspapers, enough to shock, not enough to reveal everything. Travelers who had passed the chapel began questioning their memories. Kind words felt poisoned. Prayers felt false. Some realized how close they had come to disappearing. Survivors carried guilt for years, wondering why they had lived when others had not. The Sacred Heart Chapel was ordered destroyed, not preserved, not studied, burned. Authorities believed removing it would help erase its influence. Flames consumed the wood, the cross, the rooms where faith had been twisted into fear. Smoke rose into the sky as if carrying decades of silence with it. But destruction did not bring peace. The land remained uneasy. Locals avoided it. Animals refused to graze there. Travelers took long detours. Stories spread of lights at night, whispers in the wind, and the sound of a bell that no longer existed. Whether these were imagination or guilt did not matter. The place had become marked. The Grayson name disappeared from public records. Trials were quiet. Sentences were unclear. Some believed justice was incomplete. Others believed it was enough that the chapel was gone. But the truth lingered, locked in documents few were allowed to read. Part 7 of this story is about exposure, about what happens when darkness is forced into light. The Grayson family did not fall because of violence or rebellion. They fell because silence broke. One voice escaped. One truth survived. Faith had protected them for decades. In the end, it could not protect them from the weight of their own records. The chapel had watched travelers arrive and never leave. Now the world was finally watching the chapel, and it did not look away.
After the Sacred Heart Chapel was destroyed, people expected the story to end. The Grayson family was arrested or disappeared, the land was cleared, and the trail moved on. On paper, the case was closed. But stories like this do not truly end. They change shape. They sink into memory, into rumor, into silence. And sometimes, silence is louder than truth. The land where the chapel once stood was left empty. No one rebuilt on it. No farm took root. No new church was raised. Travelers avoided the area, even when it added days to their journey. Locals said the ground felt wrong. Horses refused to step onto it. Fires burned strangely there. Whether these things were real or imagined did not matter. Fear had settled into the soil.
Official records about the Grayson case were sealed. Authorities believed the truth was too disturbing for the public. They feared it would damage trust in religion and create panic on the frontier. Newspapers mentioned parts of the story, but never the full scale. The number of victims was reduced. The religious aspect was softened. What truly happened at Sacred Heart Chapel became something only a few people fully knew. Families of the missing never received answers. Many never even learned where their loved ones had vanished. There were no marked graves, no bodies returned, no funerals, only absence. Some waited for years, believing their family members might still appear somewhere along the trail. Hope faded slowly, painfully. Survivors who had once stayed at the chapel carried guilt for the rest of their lives. They remembered the prayers, the smiles, the warmth. They wondered why they were spared when others were not. Some blamed themselves. Others lost faith completely. A few tried to warn others, but without proof, their words sounded like madness. The frontier was full of strange tales. This one blended in too easily. The Grayson name faded, but not fully. It appeared sometimes in whispers, sometimes in half-burned documents, sometimes in stories told late at night. Parents warned their children about trusting too easily, about mistaking kindness for safety, about believing that evil always looks evil. Sacred Heart Chapel became a lesson passed down quietly, stripped of details, but heavy with meaning. Years later, historians tried to piece together what had happened. They found fragments, ledgers missing pages, trial notes with blacked-out lines, letters that hinted at horror but never explained it fully. Every attempt to uncover the full truth ended the same way. Doors closed, records vanished, silence returned. Some believed the silence was intentional, that certain people had been protected, that not every member of the Grayson family had been punished, that some names were removed from records before history could judge them. Whether this was true or not, the doubt remained, and doubt, once planted, does not die easily. The land itself became part of the legend. Travelers claimed to see lantern lights at night where no buildings stood. Others heard bells ringing in the wind. Some said they heard prayers whispered from the trees. Skeptics laughed these stories away, but no one stayed long enough to prove them wrong. Fear did not need proof. What frightened people most was not the ghosts or the ruins, it was the idea behind the story. The realization that the Graysons did not hide in darkness. They lived openly. They welcomed people. They prayed with them. They used faith, something meant to heal, as a tool to destroy. That idea changed how people looked at authority forever. Churches along the trail began facing questions. Pastors were challenged. Blind trust weakened. People still believed, but they believed more carefully. Sacred Heart Chapel had shown them what happens when power goes unquestioned, when fear replaces compassion, when obedience becomes more important than humanity. The Grayson legacy was not just death, it was damage. Damage to trust, damage to faith, damage that could not be undone by burning a building or sealing a file. The real ruin was inside people's minds. Over time, the Oregon Trail faded into history. Towns replaced camps, roads replaced wagon paths, but the stories survived, reshaped for each generation. Sometimes it was told as a warning, sometimes as a ghost story, sometimes as a forgotten rumor that refused to disappear completely. Part 8 of this story is not about what the Graysons did. That horror is already known. It is about what they left behind. Empty land, broken faith, questions without answers. Proof that the most dangerous evil is not loud or wild, but calm, patient, and certain of itself. The Sacred Heart Chapel is gone, but its lesson remains. Not every place of refuge is safe. Not every voice that speaks of God speaks truth. And not every evil announces itself with violence. Some of it waits quietly, offering warmth, asking for trust, and closing the door behind you once you step inside. That is the true ending of the Grayson story. Not justice, not peace, but a warning written into history, reminding those who come after that belief without question can be as deadly as any weapon.